Morning, everybody. Welcome back to Lowry Acres. We're shooting this video the same day as we just shot our current video, and we were talking about planting this new greenhouse and doing some things in here. And I really want to touch on something that's near and dear to my heart today, and that's soil fertility. So, soil fertility is kind of a mysterious thing, right? Everybody wonders, what should I put on? Should I put on triple 12, or should I put on compost, or chicken litter, or whatever, gardens, kitchen scraps. What should I do for my garden? And we get this question a lot in the spring at the greenhouse. People coming out to buy flowers and buying vegetable transplants, especially last year with the pandemic roaring in full force last spring. People were looking for hobbies. We had, I don't know how many new gardeners we had last spring that never planted a garden, that come out to buy plants and try their hand at it, and this was a really common question. So I thought I'd go over kind of how we do some of our soil fertility around here and address that a little. So first things first, we are a conventional farm. We're not an organic farm by any stretch of the imagination. Now, that being said, we don't do anything we don't have to do, but we're not an organic farm by no means. And in our greenhouses and our cut flowers gardens, we use a lot of compost generally. With this cold weather coming in, our compost pile is still under snow now. It was under 14, 15 inches of snow just a couple days ago. So we did not get to put compost on these beds. This is a brand new houses, brand new side of the farm for us. This has been a cornfield forever. We've farmed here since back in the 50s, and this has always been one of our row crop fields. So the soil fertility is fair. It's not great, but it's fair. And generally when we open up new beds, I like to put at least 2 inches of compost on top to help loosen things up and get things going again. But with the cold weather and the snow, we just weren't able to, and we had to get flowers in the ground. So we went ahead and just used chemical fertilizer this time. And as soon as these flowers come out, they will get composted really heavily and get that worked in and going. So fertility methods we use the Kinsey-Albrecht method for soil fertility. And the Kinsey-Albrecht method is a soil balancing method of fertility, as opposed to, say, the university's method, which is a replacement sufficiency method. And there's a lot of big differences between those two. I'm a classically trained agronomist. I spent real close to a decade, 9 years, in the agriculture retail world, selling seed, chemical, fertilizer, and doing the crop scouting and all that. And then I still do some crop scouting on the side for fun. But as a classically trained agronomist, we were all taught to use the university method, and that's where all of our soil samples went. All of our recommendations come from the universities and private labs, but they use the same methods too. And those methods are based off a soil sufficiency and replacement method. So they're not necessarily building up your soil. They're telling you what you need at a minimum to grow that crop and make sure you grow a crop in the future. They do not address, imbalances in the soil. They do not address excesses in the soil. They just strictly address minimums in the soil. And the graphic we were all showed, while we were learning about soil fertility in our education, we were showed the graphic of the barrel, right? You got the barrel and you got all these individual staves, and imagine each stave is a nutrient. And whichever stave is the shortest in that barrel, that's where your water runs out. And so the thought process is, no matter how many nutrients you have in that soil or how good they are, your plants only perform to your weakest nutrient, correct? So no matter how much NPK, calcium, whatever you have in there, if your plants are short on sulfur, they're just not going to produce as well, even though you have plenty of everything else. And then that's correct to an extent. But what always bothered me is, I would have these fields every year, high productive fields. The nutrient loads would look fantastic. Everything looks great. They ought to be like prime producing farms. But at the end of the year, they would be lackluster at best, and sometimes it's pretty disappointing. And I couldn't pencil out why. It wasn't disease issues, it wasn't weed issues or pest issues. By no means. It was something in the soil that was causing our trouble. And I couldn't figure out why, and it bothered me for years and years until I met a man locally here who uses a soil man who uses the Neil Kinsey, or the Kinsey-Albrecht method. And he was trained by Neil Kinsey. And he started explaining to me why things were working like they were. and it made a lot of sense. A lot of our soils around here are very, very high in magnesium. It's not something you hear of a lot, but it's fairly common, and around here it's the rule of thumb. So our soils are very high in magnesium. We use all of our rock strata is mostly dolomitic limestone, which is a limestone with a lot of magnesium in it. And what happens when you have high magnesium soils, as I've come to learn, is there's several things happen physically and chemically in the soil. So physically, magnesium does not set off the same angles that calcium does in the soil. So if you imagine calcium particles, they set off at kind of a 90-degree angle, which makes really nice pore spaces in the soil. Magnesium sets more like a 45-degree angle is how they form their bonds. And at a 45-degree angle, there's not near as much pore space in there for water, air, and other nutrients, so on and so forth, which makes a really tight soil. Our soils are predominantly clay loams, and they're very, very tight. They do not drain well. If you dig down 6-8 inches in most of these soils, you'll find a lot of brown, black mottling. Some of that's iron, and a lot of it's magnesium. And there's probably some aluminum toxicity thrown in there too. But anyhow, so our magnesium levels were way too high in our soils, and this is nothing I was ever taught, nothing I was ever told, until I met this gentleman. He explained it to me. And when the magnesium is so high, our calcium is not working correctly in the soil. Even though we have a ton of calcium in the soil, it's not being taken up by the plants. It's rendered inactive or inert by the excess magnesium, and so is the potassium, phosphorus, and then our nitrogen and our sulfur don't work as well, and it's kind of a downhill spiral from there. And it's not that any nutrient in our soil is missing, it's just that we have a lot of magnesium, too much magnesium. And so we've been addressing that with sulfur. The sulfur in the soil, we put on a lot of sulfur and gypsum. What that does is that forms with the magnesium, makes magnesium sulfate, which is soluble. And it's a form that plants can take up readily. And that helps drive down our magnesium levels in the soil, and that brings our calcium and our potassium back up in the soil and kind of puts things back in balance. So the moral of the story is, even if you think your soil looks okay, it might not necessarily be okay. You might have enough of everything, but if you have too much of something, it can be worse than not having enough of anything. And this holds true for several things all the way around. Iron's another big one. If you have a lot of iron, if you have a lot of salt in your soils, if you live out west and you have saltier soils, that can be a big issue as well. And so we're learning how to work with this. We do use labs now that use the Kinsey-Albrecht method and make recommendations based on those. I would highly, highly recommend you find one. Mr. Kinsey, Neil Kinsey, he's over at Charleston, which is east of us here, about an hour over on the river. And he's, I guess you'd call him probably the foremost expert on this method. He trained under Mr. Albrecht, who came up with a lot of these ideas back in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And has trained a lot of agronomists since then. And if not, you can find some local labs that would do the Kinsey-Albrecht method. I think we have several local labs around here that will. I would highly recommend using them. I think you get a lot better snapshot of what your soil actually looks like and what actually needs to be done. And we do need necessary elements in there. We've got to have enough of these elements in there, but at the same time, having too much or out of balance nutrients will cause us more problems than just having enough. So that's kind of what I wanted to cover that today. And also on the compost, we get a lot of questions about compost. Organic matter is fantastic. You need all the organic matter you can get. Something I would caution is relying strictly on organic matter for fertility or compost. Yeah, it works great, but you need to know what's in your compost. Have an idea what kind of nutrients are in there and what you're actually putting in your soil. I have seen some pretty poor compost applied to gardens, and then people come back and say, well, my garden didn't grow right. This happened, or plants look like this, and it's pretty obvious nutrient deficiency. Yeah, they were applying compost, but it wasn't good compost. So I would make sure you're using a high quality compost. Try to find out what's in it. Chicken litter is another fantastic option. We get some chicken litter locally here, and we'll just pile it and let it compost a while, and then we'll spread it out as we need it and blend it in. So there's a lot of methods to soil fertility, but I would highly recommend the Kinsey Albrecht method. If you have any questions about it, drop them in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer them and help you however I can. There's a couple more books, and I was trying to think of the name of the book offhand. It's something about building soils. It's a brochure that Acres USA puts out, or a little book that they have on their website, and it teaches the soil balancing method and gives you the ratios and how to figure that. And so you can use that at home with some pretty simple math and a calculator. You can get a pretty good idea of what you need to do with your soils. So I would just highly recommend that. Anyhow, if you have any questions, just leave in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you like what you see, and we'll be back next week with more video.